Hello, everybody.
Told you.
Welcome to the Tree
Hey, I'm
Planters podcast.
frozen.
It's a little bit of a rough start. Hey, Jacob, can you hear us? Oh, still can't hear us. We've been trying to get Jacob online. Jacob is joining us today. We're going to talk about farming and youth and how we can support more youth
Hey,
getting into
can you?
farming. I can hear you.
You can hear me, but I am frozen on my own screen.
Oh, hmm.
I see you moving though, Adam.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You?
I
we
see you two moving. Can you
Yeah.
see me with my thumbs up?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I just look frozen on my screen, but I guess you can hear me.
I
Yeah.
can hear you, but you can't hear us.
But I can't hear you now. I
Can't.
could
Hmm.
just hear you.
You can. Oh, you can hear.
Welcome to the Tree Planters podcast.
Yeah. Well,
I can't hear you now.
um,
But when I signed in, I could hear you.
okay. So as Jacob is, let's see what it says. Push to talk. What's that? No, no, no. I think that's
We might be doing a pantomime today, everybody. Uh,
yeah. Well, this is the way we roll. Kind of by the skin of our teeth, and teeth don't have skin, so
no, they don't.
we
So
Oh,
don't roll
you
with
just
much.
came through for a moment.
Oh,
I got
well,
you for just a brief moment.
in
okay.
the end, this is really exemplary of internet connections across Simcoe County, where we have all these small little urban centers, and when you get outside of them, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, you still don't have reliable internet.
Can you hear me
Yeah,
now?
I can hear you.
You can hear me. I
Yeah,
just can't hear you. Hmm.
strange.
That's going to make it tricky.
Um, yeah. So check. So I'm just typing in the chat to Jacob here. Check the audio settings.
Our audience is on the
Um,
edge of their seats wondering how we're going to actually be able to solve this crisis by the
yeah,
time
yeah.
by the time our podcast is over.
Well, check your audio settings. Using the
How about I
gear
let you two figure
icon.
that out and I'll just do some intro.
Okay,
I'll,
go
I'll
for it.
be the distraction. So we've known Jacob for quite a bit. For those that live in the Aurelia area, you probably do as well. He runs Bass Lake Farms and has always been a really strong proponent of food sovereignty, local food movement, and has been really at the forefront of Lakehead University campaign to have the farmland on their Aurelia campus used as a teaching farm. So we're hoping
Yeah,
to
I'm
have,
checking the audio settings, but
we're
Stop.
hoping today to have a productive conversation. But at this point, I'm not really sure what it's going to look like.
maybe I'll try rejoining.
Okay, sounds good. And otherwise, so we're also in the midst of our summer. I don't know what summer season, which is what it is. Anyway, but so work is a little bit here and there. Like we continue, but it's just a little bit more loosely structured than typical
Yeah,
for
it's
our already fairly loosely structured work schedule.
yes. I think that the fact that we're both parents makes the summers a little bit more challenging.
Okay, can you hear
Mhm.
me?
Yes, we can
Yeah,
hear
we can
you.
hear you, Jacob.
You can hear me. I can't hear you.
Um, And so I was just off for a
Um,
week's camping trip up in Tobermory, which was
can I?
incredible.
Perhaps it's my phone. I'm using my phone because my computer is broken.
Okay,
So I'm gonna go. I'm at Lakehead, so I'm gonna see if I can borrow a computer, and I'll be back in about 10 minutes.
sure.
Sure, no
Sounds
problem.
good. Um, yeah, Tobermory. And man, this is a beautiful province we live in. I mean, that's like, so heading up from Barrie to Tobermory is beautiful and massive province that we live in. Heading up from Barrie to Tobermory is a very small slice of it, but it's just stunning. And maybe this gets a little bit to what we're going to hopefully talk about with Jacob today, which is all the farmland. Beautiful farmland on the way up there. Windmills. Yeah, and then when you get up in Tobermory, it's just. Have you been up there, Margaret?
Did you stay at the national park? Is that where you stayed, or where did you?
No, we stayed at a private campground near to the town called Land's End. It was quite nice. Yeah, the friends that we went with booked the site. Clean, a little bit more compact. Like private. They tend to be, like you're trying to get as much return on value, I guess, from the property as you can. So you maybe pack the sites a little bit closer together.
Mm,
But it was very well maintained and in a pretty decent location.
mhm. Part of the green belt, all up there, right?
That's right. Lots of Greenbelt Walks signs on the way up.
Yeah,
The Bruce Trail goes all through there.
yeah. The only
Uh,
time I've been in that area was when I went to the Bruce National Park, but I've only been there in the winter.
oh, okay.
In a yurt, which was almost a disastrous vacation, but we survived.
Hmm,
Almost.
hmm.
Barely. We
What was the disaster? Almost. What was the
Well, it
near?
was our first time staying in a yurt, and it was our first time going to Bruce National Park. And there was some really bad weather, and so we were supposed to arrive by check-in at like I don't know 4 o'clock or something. And then life happens, and all of a sudden we're arriving at the national park at like 8:30. It's pitch black. We haven't had dinner, like one thing after another. And so for anybody that stayed in yurts, there's always like a wood stove, but we were going to buy wood from because you're not allowed to bring wood in, right? So we were going to
Hmm,
buy wood, except by the time we got there, the park office was closed. And the amount of wood that we had in the yurt was like we had 4 logs.
hmm,
And so we were quite uh, it was like very tense. So we had 2 nights booked. We had no idea about what to do. The we couldn't get didn't have enough wood to get the fire hot enough to actually make a difference in the yurt, and it's like minus 22 outside.
hmm,
And so we there was no message. We asked them. We told them we were going to be late. Can you please put some wood in the yurt for us, whatever else? And so we got 4 or 5 logs or whatever. So we were at this point where we're freezing, uh, and we don't know what to do. We're like, okay, the temperature keeps dropping. We have no wood. It's too late to go somewhere else. The park office is closed. And we kind of split into two. There was the team stay and team let's go home. So Jacob and Steve were on this is getting ridiculous. It's super cold. We're just going to go home. And Matthew and I were like, okay, there's other people in yurts. Maybe they have extra wood, right? So Matthew and I are like, you know what? We're just going to go to the other yurt and see if they have extra wood that they can lend us for the evening. So we go, and we met this couple from Newfoundland who were super nice, and whose name I don't remember. One was named Chuck. Anyways, if you're listening, thank you out there. They were like, "Oh, did you not know?" We're like, "Not know what?" And they're like, "Oh, well, they have like a spot where they put the wood so that at night, if you run out, you can go get some." I'm like,
hmm,
no, how are we supposed to know? We didn't know. There was no signs. There was no, but it's like a thing. Like once you're there, then the path. So they gave us some wood, and then they they had a sled, and that's at the park, and so they helped us with the sled and took us over to the woodshed, and we loaded up, and everything was fine. And then it got too hot, but it was almost disastrous. And
hmm.
but kindness of strangers, and everyone's probably more pro-social than you think. But didn't mean to cut up your story, but we went to Tobermory and around the grottos and stuff that day with those people.
Um, yeah, that. Hmm. It's so. What kind of activities did you do around there? And how many nights did you stay?
2 nights. The first night was a bit of a write-off. Um, the second day, we mostly went snowshoeing and hiking, and then we ended up just playing games in the yurt the second night, trying to
Hmm.
figure out how to turn up and turn down the wood stove to get it right.
Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, it was really nice. I think in the winter I tend to be more of a hibernator than a let's go out for 8 hours of a day.
Hmm.
So yeah, we just that's what we ended up doing, and it worked out really well. And the boys were like, "We should go back to a yurt," and I'm like, "Oh, I don't know." We'd have to make sure we're there on time if it's the winter,
Yeah.
to make sure that we get there with to be able to get the wood. But now that we know, if you're going to Bruce National Park, just so you know, there is a spot to get wood, and then you pay the next day, right? Like you say, "Oh, I took." It's on a bit of an honor system. I took 4 bags or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Uh, then we had an abundance of wood. We took a picture of it. We're like, oh my gosh, look at us hoarding. Just went through the scarcity of the first night. Uh,
Scarcity, yeah, scarcity to plenty,
yeah. So
or
when we
overabundance.
so when we left probably like 2 bags of wood for the next people. We were
Hmm.
just like, just keep it. So we shared. So it was the whole story arc of scarcity to abundance to generosity.
Hmm.
Generosity was in there in the beginning too.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, it's beautiful. I like highly recommend going up in the summer months as well. I mean, it's very popular for good reason. We got to some of the key sites there.
Hmm.
There's a beach called Singing Sands, which is like Wasaga, but emphasize like it's far more. It's much more shallow. Goes out like it's almost tedious how far you have to walk until the water is deep enough to actually be able to swim.
Right.
But that also means that it's very warm and it's excellent for kids too. Of course, you got to keep an eye. I mean, shallow water is really the dangerous water often for drowning mishaps, and especially with younger kids. So that's something to keep in mind if you do end up going up there. But yeah, beautiful. You gotta. There's limited parking available, which also limits the number of people on the beach to like a relatively small number,
Hmm.
which is actually quite nice. So it doesn't. It's not overcrowded. It's warm. One of the interesting things I discovered, I had not known about Ashish before. I think that's how you pronounce it, Ashish,
Okay.
which is a atmospheric phenomenon. I don't know, it's like a almost like a false tide kind of thing.
Hi,
So hi. So can
I
you
can
hear
hear
us?
you.
Oh, great,
We were just talking
fantastic.
about seiches.
Yeah. Do you know what a Ashish is?
Siish. No.
I believe it's Seiche. So we're just talking, shooting the shit until you were able to join us. I just got back from camping in Tobermory, and there's a beach there in the area called Singing Sands Beach, and it's extremely shallow. You can walk out forever almost, before it gets deep. But one of the odd things that I had never experienced before there was this seiche. And so we had set up our sort of little area with sun tent and whatever kind of near to the water. And then all of a sudden you see the water kind of like creeping up, like the tide's coming in. And so we had to pull back all of our stuff real quick. Of course, there isn't a proper tide there like you'd have on an ocean, but it's a seiche, so it's a combination kind of I believe of like atmospheric pressure in the area, but then also just winds kind of mimicking a tide, and because it's so shallow, even a little sort of movement can kind of seemingly kind of travel a long distance across the shore, across the
Hmm.
beach. So that was cool.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then you're like your absolute prototype like swimming in like that crystal clear blue Georgian Bay kind of rocky
Hmm.
sort of uh, and this was in another area from this beach area. But like cold water, but just it's just stunning, beautiful. And then after reading the sign, the warning sign on the entranceway that is like one person a year typically dies at that location because the waters are so dangerous, which
Hmm.
made it feel even colder in retrospect. But yeah.
So
Anyways, welcome, Jacob.
yeah, I was gonna say we did your intro during that piece, but I wondered if you could start with telling us what you're kind of up to since you're. I was explaining you as a food sovereignty advocate. Uh,
Venture capitalist.
yeah, a local food advocate as well. Talked about the Lakehead University farmland experimental farm and all that sort of stuff. So, what kind of
Yeah,
things are
Farm
you up
Lab.
to now?
Well, I've been thinking about that whole how do I describe myself, like food sovereignty. I think food sovereignty is just like sovereignty. I mean, sometimes we add the word food on front, but really what we're getting at is like having people in charge of their own lives, like having a say in the decisions that impact them and having power over their own lives. And so for me, like food is just an avenue, a vehicle, a means to get there. But ultimately, it's about more than just food and food systems. It's about like how we live um, on this earth with one another. And really, for me, it's about like a democratic way of living. So recognizing the inherent value and dignity of one another, including the like the wild, the non-human, the more than human, non other humans or other beings that we share this place with, recognizing their value too, and trying to respect that and live in a way that everyone can thrive long term.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so I approach like those questions around of sustainability, like how do we sustain life and how do we regenerate life? I approach those questions around from the perspective from like a food lens. So looking at how we eat and what we eat and how we produce what we eat. But I also look at like the other needs that we have: housing, water, education, healthcare, energy, these other kinds of things. I just tend to gravitate towards food because I get hungry every few hours and it comes to mind. And I think most people are similar. So food is just one of those primary, primordial needs that we all share. That's just kind of an easy entry point into these discussions for a lot of people. And I also just really love gardening and being outside and cultivating life. And so, yeah, and sharing food with one another and eating delicious food. I think that's kind of core and central to a good life. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I promote food sovereignty in that sense then, but also it's about
Big,
justice.
it's bigger than that.
It's bigger than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it's justice. It's about, trying to figure out what it means to live a good life, happiness, those deeper questions.
Those small little questions that rattle
Yeah.
around
Why
here.
are we here?
Who am I? What am I supposed all of those wonderful things. What did you
But
find when
yeah.
you do you find people like when Adam and I started talking about preserving nature and making sure that we have like communities that are sustainable, like as far as sprawling, like, that we can have a balance between where we live and food available to us and also space for the others, that the other beings that we share the planet with. I was Now maybe you're less naive than I was at the time, but I was shocked at how political something so benign seemed to be, like how much visceral hate people had about that idea of limits on things, limits on, how much we can destroy, limits on how much we can just pave over things. Did you find any of that same? Do you find that people respond with the discussion about food and democracy and how it relates to justice? Is there any of that kind of like pushback that you see or experience?
Yeah. I think when I first started in this, I was like my main concern as I was a teenager and into my early 20s was really about climate change. And I was learning a lot about climate change and how, we're destabilizing the Earth's biosphere, and it's going to be hotter and hotter, and life will be harder and harder to continue. And I found that really troublesome. And at the time, like in the late 2000s, I found there was a lot of like people who just wanted to debate it and deny that climate change was even a thing. And they saw it as, as you were saying, a limitation on their lives, like as if we have to stop doing all these things that we have become accustomed to doing,
Mhm.
or that we have to change our way of life and even change our identities. And people find that kind of thing very threatening. And I found it very hard to like win people over and organize. And also like the thought of changing our entire energy grid was a bit overwhelming for people.
Mhm.
Especially when I like started taking a more equity approach or like lens and justice perspective, and then realizing that a third of the people in my community don't even have like dinner to eat. And here I am concerned about this thing that might happen in 50 years or something. So that's when I really shifted toward more of a food lens and looking at not necessarily taking things away from people, but how do we actually create systems that we could actually have more and more of the things we actually need, like of the good things.
Mhm.
And as we get more of the good things in our lives, then the need of having all this like consumerism and materialism and just consumption for consumption's sake, the more that will like dissipate when we're satisfied, when we have what we actually need. And then I also strategically just thought that I don't need to like convince people. I just need to find people
Mm.
who are looking for like the things that we need. And then once I find them, and then we just work together on producing those needs, fulfilling those needs.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, they get caught up on these debates. Like I think a lot of the people that you're thinking of who are like, who make it all political, I think they're spending a lot of time online. And like with the propaganda online and stuff, like, we're hearing a lot of that. They're going to take everything away from us. And
Yeah. Tell us where we can and can't go, and the
yeah.
15-minute cities and all that kind of stuff. It's yeah, pretty unserious in some ways. Adam?
I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts on I guess, the tension between uh, the availability of food, and maybe you want to contest my use of that term food to some of this stuff, like high calorie product or whatever. And how the character of a lot of that stuff, which really kind of hits all of those like pleasure centers. It's like designed to satisfy certain high value needs and desires and wants and whatever in people. And then the tension between that and the tension between, or the tension between that and I think what you're talking about, which is food that is more intentionally gained, perhaps, or arrived at, or whatever. So there's on the one hand, maybe things almost fall into your lap in too great of a way. And so then there's problems that we see in our society that result from that. The fall in the lap maybe is an over exaggeration because you do have to pay money for this sort of stuff typically, but the cost per calorie is very small compared to what it's been in the past. And then on the other hand, you have food that takes a lot of time, more effort, more intentionality, And I guess what I'm thinking of with this is there was a book that the poet Robert Bly, I believe it was, came out with a number of years, a few decades ago at least, and I'm momentarily gapping on the name. Oh, the Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart, I believe, something like that. Which led me to no, I think I'm getting my things a little cross. Was it Robert Bly? There was a book called Iron John, and I'm conflating the two for some reason. Anyways, he talks about catabasis and the value of actually putting effort and hard work into things, and how that not only does it result in something better in terms of the item that you're working on, but it also develops growth in yourself in doing that. So I'm just interested in sort of that sort of dichotomy that we see, where on the one hand we've got such an abundance of calories in our society, easy calories, and then on the other hand, that sort of more healthy and sustainable approach, which requires effort and work, but results in something that I think is more beneficial but isn't also, I mean, maybe this is something that we can get into later. That's also like there's an availability problem, at least with respect to the way that our economy is currently structured to a lot of that stuff. And I don't know, and I apologize if I'm not posing this question very clearly.
It's a
No,
loaded
I think
question, Adam.
What's that?
It's a loaded question.
what I'm hearing is that you're saying that there's this tension between, this cheap food that's widely available, and then there's this other type of food that, let's just call it like the good food that is more expensive, it's harder to produce, it's less quantity, but potentially much higher, like higher quality and of higher value, but that requires more work.
Yeah, and maybe the use my use of the word tension maybe sets
Yeah.
up something a little bit that I didn't want to set up there, but just that those two kind of things that seem to be in sort of opposition a little
Yeah.
bit. Yeah.
Well, the first thing I'll say is that food is complex. So this is the other thing is I'm a student at Lakehead. I'm doing this PhD in educational studies, and I'm looking at this concept of food literacy, and which is a concept in our curriculum, in the Ontario curriculum. So students in our schools are supposed to be learning about food, and one of the things about food is it's really complicated. So food means different things to different people. Like if you ask a dietitian what food means, they'll talk about like the nutrient qualities of different foodstuffs and how to make a complete diet. And then, if you talk to a farmer about food, then they'll talk about, how it's produced and the value of the commodities and how it's, part of their livelihood and these kinds of things. And then you take a different cultural perspectives on food and, food to, you know, Italian means something different than it means to, someone from Japan. And we each have our own individual food cultures. Different food items carry different meanings. So that I just want to put that out there. So when we're talking about food, food can mean many different things from many different people. Um, and we have a tendency of I think there's a tendency, at least in the food movement, like the local food movement, to try to create a hierarchy of food that some is better than other food, and that can be helpful and not helpful at the same time.
Hmm.
In terms of this idea of food availability, the modern industrial food system produces a ton of food, a surplus of food, more than is needed for the basic like caloric intake of human beings. Like we can survive, maybe not thrive on a super healthy diet, but we can survive on the food that's produced through the industrial food system. I think some estimates like a third or a half of it. It's hard to measure food waste, but a significant portion of the food produced through the modern industrial food system is wasted. So it's more than sufficient. Um, because of this, industrial food system, the traditional or indigenous food systems, but also like, you know, pre-industrial food systems or peasant agriculture have not completely disappeared, but they are becoming less and less common. So we have, you know, and which is what I'm finding. Like we don't have that many farmers locally, for example, people who actually grow local food for local markets. We're de-skilling the population, so people don't necessarily know how to like bake bread from scratch or have all these traditional food skills. So they're becoming increasingly dependent on this like capitalist industrial food system. So there is this like idea that this well, let me take a step back here. I would say that the food that the industrial food system is producing, it's just externalizing the costs. So when you say it's just cheaper, more available, that's because like it's not necessarily less work. It's that the work is being done by like temporary foreign workers through the foreign worker program. The work is often highly like exploited. The labor, the people that are doing the work are exploited. They're not really well paid in this like food service industry. Like you think about all the people who work in the industrial food system, from the farm workers to the people in processing facilities and packing facilities and retail facilities and the fast food facilities. And a lot of that work is not well compensated for. It's also not necessarily the most joyful work and meaningful work, despite its value to the rest of us in society. So there's that. Also, the environmental costs are externalized. So through great pollution, erosion of soil, and destruction of habitat ecosystems, greenhouse gas emissions, so on and so forth. There's many different kinds of environmental externalities. So to the extent that this industrial food system can actually be sustained is questionable. And then also there's like individual health impacts. So while it may be cheaper in terms of like out-of-pocket expense in the short term, I think it's actually more expensive because of its health impacts. Mm-hmm. Not to mention like the economic and ecological impacts. So it's a bit of an illusion that this cheap surplus food stuff is actually cheaper or, more convenient or better. I think, as you're alluding to, a lot of it is purposely designed by food engineers to be highly addictive. And then you also add on like advertising and marketing to that. And so people are, desire it. And then we just don't have access to any meaningful alternatives to it. So because, we don't really have a well-developed alternative food system, because the dominant food system, I'm not sure that it can survive with an alternative food system. I think the only way that it continues to survive is through having a domination, a control over the marketplace. It needs to continuously grow and grow and grow.
Sorry, did you mean that the dominant economic system couldn't survive with the?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, both the dominant agricultural system is like a core to that economic system.
Yeah.
So, like for example, farm scales continuing to increase over and over. Every like farm census we see, the scale increases and the quantity and diversity of farms decrease.
Yeah, we have farms larger than 3,500 acres has nearly doubled between 2001 and 2000 over the past 20 years, roughly.
Yeah. So the equipment that's required to manage those farms is like very special equipment.
Very expensive too.
Very expensive. So these farmers, they need to continue to grow and cultivate more land so that they can, service the costs to that equipment. And so we're in direct competition. Like those of us who are small scale ecological farmers, we are in a competition with these large scale farmers who are competing over limited land base and
Yeah.
also competing over a limited market, but also competing over limited like public subsidies and public policy and limited, political power and priority.
So here's I don't know if loaded question is the right term to use, but you'd mentioned how much, well, and maybe this answers it already, how much food we waste with the current agricultural system and economic system it's entwined with. Uh, would turning to more sustainable practices be able to um, support our, I don't know, our economy or our society sufficiently? And maybe that's through reducing the amount of waste.
Well, for perspective, like I'm also on the board at the Sharing Place Food Center in Aurelia. So that's one of our region's largest food banks. And we have a food recovery program at the Sharing Place. So we have refrigerated food trucks that go around a few times a week to about half a dozen or so um, grocery stores in Aurelia. And these food recovery trucks take like hundreds of tons of food that would otherwise be destined for the landfill and
Wow.
um, recover it. And with the help of volunteers, like a couple hundred volunteers, can sort it, pack it, put it in cold storage, and then in a commercial kitchen, prepared into meals for various agencies around our community for people who are experiencing food insecurity.
Hmm.
And I think about that question all the time, like what would an alternative to that system be? And also as like a small scale farmer, like every year when I was managing our market garden, I would spend like January and February making a crop plan. So I'd actually be like with my spreadsheets determining how many cabbages I was going to grow based on how many customers I was going to have. And I think about these questions like I'm in Aurelia, so we have, 35,000 people. And I think about like, well, how many cabbages does Aurelia need? You know,
Hmm.
and what if we had a system that could produce the amount of cabbages we need? And maybe we always want to plan for a surplus. Like on the farm, I'm always planning, I need 100 cabbages, so I'm planning to grow 125
Hmm.
just as things could happen. So there's some surplus built in as a contingency. But to actually have a plan for it, and then to have everyone in the community who are going to be involved in those cabbages in some way, whether it's through the growing, the processing, the distribution, the preparation, the consumption of it, having everybody actually like in a dialogue, in a conversation about that, so that we could work together to create the most efficient system that we could.
Hmm.
But right now, the whole food production distribution system is all basically in the hands of a few large companies. Many of them are like transnational or foreign based. And the people who are consuming the food at the end of the day are not in any position of power over the production of that food, or don't really have any say at all over the production, distribution of that food. And so a significant number of people in our community are just kind of receiving um, the surplus of that food that's destined for the waste cycle, um, thanks to the generosity of many volunteers.
Hmm.
And so I think about what could a different system be, and that would require us like actually having democratic control over the production of the food and the land that food production happens on, and all the inputs that go into that, and every step of that production and distribution processing system.
Which kind of gets us to some of what I think you might be interested in talking about as well. But so we can move on there unless Margaret, you've got something you want to jump in
Well,
with.
I was just actually thinking about something I read a while ago. Was one of the one of the biggest lies that capitalism tells us is that we're building a resilient system with lots of choice, and in fact, it's very fragile, right? So people are in places where they don't have access to land to grow food. Therefore, they have to buy it. Therefore, and it goes up and up the chain. People think that they have a lot of housing choice, but they actually don't, because there's a lot of conglomerates that own that too. And then you get further into infrastructure and shared community resources, except the infrastructure is based on car dependence. That's also very fragile. So, really going back to your equity lens, I was thinking, Jacob, about the resilience of a community is dependent upon the resilience of the individual, or at the smallest part, right? Um, Thinking of the analogy with the chain, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Not that to make people be weak or strong, but similarly, your community is only going to be as resilient as the individual can be resilient. And so we've really set up a lot of systems that individuals have a very hard time being resilient, and they require a lot of volunteerism, subsidies, like charity. Even when we go back to COVID and thinking about vaccines and how we couldn't actually control whether vaccines were made here when they came. We were at the charity, and similar with our food systems. If something happens, we're now again relying on the goodwill and charity of others that may have their own competing needs. So, anyways, I was just reflecting on that whole thing of, we think we're in a very resilient, robust system, and frankly, we're in a pretty fragile system. Is how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very like reliable if you have income.
Yes.
So
Yep.
like if you're a higher income earner, then it's a great system because you can get like wide selection of goods and have your pick, and you control the market so that you have all these people kind of working to satisfy your needs and demands. But the issue is that it's costly to the rest of society through these negative externalities, but also that many people just don't have access to that system.
Yep.
And so it's weird to live in a highly like I've traveled different countries, and like one place I went a couple of years ago was South Africa, and they live in a highly stratified society with racial hierarchies and class hierarchies, and there's some people who are very well off who live in gated communities with you know barbed wire electric walls with armed guards out front, and they have beautiful houses and I'm sure whatever food stuff they want, and the top of everything. But then you just have like a majority of people living in poverty and destitution, and um, competing against one another for the remainders. And that's, to me, that's just kind of a gross system, and that's not the kind of society I want to live in. I want to live in one that's more, I'm going to call it democratic, but we could also say more equal, but also I think more free. That people are actually freer to move around and feel safe and feel cared for and to care for others and to explore and travel and have the ability to dream and create things rather than just working in service of like a small minority of people and their you know materialistic demands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's where like the disability justice is kind of parallel. Sorry, Adam, I know you want to, but I'm just
No, it's all right.
now where disability justice advocates talk about, if you want to know what the system's really like, you look at how it treats the marginalized, because for the grace of God, if you will, like, you're going to be out of that system until you can no longer fit into it anymore, whether because of income, whether because of ability, and then or race or class or whatever it happens to be. And when you're outside of that chosen few, that perfect system where you have all the things you need to be taken care of, if the system really responds to the way that they treat the marginalized, and so there's this pressure to stay in that class, so you do, or into that economic zone, or into whatever, that so you don't have to actually face what the system is really like. And I think that's a hard part too. So the equity lens with food, you know it's it's really, to your point, not just about sovereignty of what you get to eat, but like, who makes those choices? How accessible is it for you? I don't know if either of you have read Sonia Renee Taylor. She has a book called Body is Not an Apology, and talking a lot about how politics always boils down to the body. You know, what you can do with your body, what you put in with your body, how your body is judged, whether that be race or size or ability. And I think about food, and what we started on earlier was this discussion about what's good food and what's bad food. And you know, that morality of what is good and bad helps us define if we're good or bad, and then that leads to class. It leads to a whole bunch of other things. You know, they're a healthy person because they eat good food, and they're an unhealthy person because they eat bad food. And this is a worthy person because they shop at farmers market. This is an unworthy person because they shop at McDonald's, right? Like there's this whole morality that threads through all of these systems about how we think about our body, how we think about what we put into it, how we think about food. And it's really just like, can we make sure that we're good? You know, that Puritan streak of like, are we chosen? Are we good? And that goes into food and makes it super complicated, just like you were saying earlier, Jacob. I'll shut up now because I was just sorry, my brain's just going.
Well, and to Jacob's point, I mean, there's so many different, like what's good and bad in some respects, at least in terms of food, kind of depends on your circumstances. If you're in a desert, I don't know, a bag of Doritos is pretty darn healthy, maybe. But I wanted to move the conversation along a little bit because Jacob, you shared a resource with me a while ago from the National Farmers Foundation, and this gets at a little bit a lot, I think, of what we're talking about here, which is kind of enabling access to food in myriad ways. Do you want to give us a little kind of Cole's notes of the
Sure.
organization and what it's trying to do?
Yeah. Well, so the National Farmers Foundation is a charity, arm's length from the National Farmers Union, which is a long-standing farmer-led organization that has been at the forefront of a lot of different, farmer advocacy, um, around various, topics going back many decades. And I'm a member of the National Farmers Union in Ontario, and also of our local Simcoe Dufferin chapter, local 347. Shout out to the Simcoe Dufferin local. And the National Farmers Foundation, and also shout out to my partner Madeline Fournier here, who's working on doing some research with the National Farmers Foundation around alternative farmland tenure models. But one of the situations that we're in terms of food access is that the farmland that is primarily used to grow food, I mean, food can also come from lakes and rivers and oceans and forests and fields and wildlands, but most of our food is coming from farmlands. And in Canada, farmland is primarily considered to be like a private good, so under the private property regime. And throughout our history as a country, we've had various laws surrounding who can own farmland and how it can be owned, with an emphasis on this mythical family farm. So you have kind of it's a traditional family structure: husband, wife. Husband's the farmer, the wife is the mother of all the kids, and you raise this farm family, and then that's how much of the country was settled, was through the King of England or the Crown appropriating Indigenous lands and then giving it for free, typically, to settlers, on the condition that they'll clear cut the forests and build a cabin and grow crops. And that's how much of our land, at least here in Simcoe County, and we can, elsewhere across the country, where was originally settled. And we have this vision that, small family farms are the good system. That's the good ideal system that we're working towards. But we have a situation in our contemporary society where that family type model is also not available to most, or I don't know about most people, but a significant number of people, whether they're like young people or maybe they're older people or they're coming from diverse family backgrounds and they're not coming from intergenerational wealth. So some people are born onto these farms and then they have them given to them through like, intergenerational farm transfer, inheritance. But increasingly, we have people living in dense urban settings who are not coming from these backgrounds and do not have access to farmland. And farmland, meanwhile, like all land in our society, is a commodity and it's traded on the market. And so it's become a speculative commodity. And we see that farmland in our area is being bought and sold by non farmers.
Mhm.
And in some cases, by like developers who sit on it and wait for boundary expansions to occur where they can then rezone it from agriculture to other uses. And then the value of that land will double, triple, quadruple, or, a significant explosion of value because of its non-agricultural uses. And so these non-agricultural uses of this land is displacing agricultural uses. So basically what I'm saying, as a young person, most young people don't have $1 million or $2 million to buy farmland. And so then the situation is that they have to lease farmland if they want access to it. And typically there's not a lot of people who are willing to lease farmland for like small scale ecological farming practices, which require a lot of time on the land and a lot of labor. So if they are going to be leasing their land, it's usually for like hay crop production or like corn or soy or wheat or some other field crop that can be planted, and then the farmer doesn't need to live there, doesn't need to come there every day to check on it and maintain it and harvest it. Whereas if you're raising animals or if you're raising other, vegetable fruit crops or other crops, then you need to be there more regularly. And typically you need to live there as well in order to actually maintain it. And it's very hard to find a lease where you can lease land, live there, maintain the crop. So usually what I've noticed among my peers of young farmers is they'll get a year on a lease or 2 years, and then they'll get bumped out. So they'll start building all this infrastructure, they'll invest in this farm business, and then they'll get bumped out of that place. And then they'll have to go to some other place and have to try to move the whole thing. And then they get bumped again, and then they usually give up. Sometimes we see wealthy professionals or people who come from intergenerational wealth, they'll be able to like purchase farmland. But often these are like more so in the form of like hobby farms. So they're not really full-time farming. They're not farming for a living or for a livelihood. It's kind of a passion project, but it's not something that they're reliant on. And so they're not necessarily focused on creating productive systems and creating profitable systems for their own livelihood. And so we see that the average age of farmers is increasing, the size and scale of the farm is increasing, the diversity of production is decreasing, and we have less and less people living and working in rural areas in an agricultural context. And that leads to like the decline of the rural economies, changing landscapes and demographics in rural areas, and what some call rural gentrification. So a lot of people being bumped out and a lot of people who can't even access. So there's a lot of young, new, diverse farmers coming from non-farming backgrounds who have a very difficult time accessing farmland and accessing long-term farm tenure on which to grow diversified farm businesses or farm enterprises.
So
So that's the work that the National Farmers Foundation is looking at alternatives to this, like the mainstream private family farm operation. So we're talking like could be co-ops, land trusts, farmland trusts, public access to farmland, or publicly owned and managed farmland, whether that's through conservation authorities or provincial and federal departments or institutions. Like in Ottawa, for example, they have the National Capital Commission, which owns, I'm not sure, hundreds or thousands of acres of farmland, and then they lease it out to farmers on long-term leases, short and long-term leases. There's also the Rouge Valley Urban National Park, and in Ontario, the Dufferin, the Pickering, the airport lands. that are now going to become an agricultural park of around like 10,000 acres. And so there's various alternative models that exist. And so the National Farmers Foundation is working on trying to document those models, to learn, to gather information and resources to support individuals and communities to come up with alternatives to this so that young people in our area, if they want to farm and they want to become farmers, and they don't want to be um, saddled with a $1 million, $2 million mortgage, not that they would qualify for that. But even if they were, they would be saddled with this epic mortgage that would make it very difficult to have a farm business. And so farmland access is just one piece of that puzzle. We also need to have, education and support for young farmers, training, access to capital or the infrastructure and equipment that they need, and then access to markets and all these other things. So it's to create this alternative food system is a bit complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of different players, and that farmland access piece is just one piece that I think isn't really being talked about so much by the mainstream food justice movement, which is often coming from more of a consumer-based perspective, more of like an urban consumer-based perspective, rather than looking at the production side of it.
That's fascinating. I think, I mean, it's also fascinating that to hear that there's sort of concrete examples of some of these solutions being implemented not too far away. Anything sort of pop up in your mind?
Week,
Sorry, go ahead.
Last week, Madeline and I went to Tiverton, Ontario, near Lake Huron, and this I think is in Bruce County. Correct me if I'm wrong. Right next to the Bruce Power Plant. And the Ontario Farmland Trust, which is an organization that works on farmland protection, preservation, and has for over 20 years through typically farmland easements on farmland to protect it from non-agricultural uses and developments. They recently received their first donation of farmland. So the couple who owned the farmland, they passed away, and those who benefited, inherited the land, they decided that they would give it to this Ontario Farmland Trust. So now this nonprofit owns this farm, and now they're working on developing programming with local farmers and young farmers to give long-term, short, medium, long-term leases to new and diverse farmers to do more agroecological, sustainable farming enterprises on that land with kind of a community of support to that.
Yeah, I think that Anna on our board, Adam,
Yep.
she the farm.
Anna was there.
Yeah, but I think she's planning on giving some of her land to the Ontario Farmland Trust as well. I think they're talked about putting an easement on some of her farmland, which is
yeah. So Anna and Mike, Mike's on the board of the Ontario Farmland Trust, and Anna is Mike's partner, and they have a farmland easement on their farm in Romero Township.
Mm-hmm.
Easements are one tool to protect farmland. Just like a conservation easement will protect land from being developed. There's also like cultural easements that we can have with Indigenous communities that can put on the legal title around giving or providing for Indigenous cultural access to lands. But just because that the property has an easement on it for agriculture doesn't mean that agriculture will actually happen on it. It just prevents non-agricultural developments from taking place.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily make the land accessible to new and young farmers or any kind of farming. So easements are one tool of many. Whereas, a farm with a farmland easement on it can be sold to a non-farmer, and they can build a big mansion on it and cut their hay once a year and maintain their farm property class tax rate. But really, the main use is residential and like a private estate.
Right.
And
that's what I think is happening in our area.
Yeah.
Yeah, agreed.
I feel like we need another podcast episode here to actually start
Part two.
actually digging into some of this stuff because there's so much. But I'm a little bit cognizant of the time getting away on us. Jacob, we've got 3 questions that we ask our guests at the end of our podcasts. So the first is, what advice would you give a young person who wants to make a difference?
Oh, don't give up. And don't think that you have to do it all on your own. There's lots of people out there who are making a difference and could use help and support in doing that. So a lot of times we think that we have to do everything all by ourselves, or we have to start this whole new thing, or you carry it all on ourselves. But one of the things that I do a lot is I just join. I join like everything I can. If I see someone doing something about something, I'll go and I'll listen and I'll support as much as I can, and I'll learn about what they're doing, and I'll offer whatever support I can. And then the more you do that, the more you learn that there's so many different people working on so many different things. And then now you can start like trying to connect the dots, and you can eventually find your passion and find where you fit into this like great puzzle of life and change. But just like go out. I think, like life is half of life is just showing up.
This one of man, we definitely need more time here. But this just makes me like one of the things that I initially wanted to get at with my first question there was like the empathetic relationship that you have to have with the land and with nature and with these other beings that you mentioned first off in this type of farming practice that you have, as opposed to an industrial agricultural practice, which I'm not sure there's a ton of empathy there, but this is a totally new podcast that maybe we need to get into. But what you just, in terms of the joining and that sort of sense of curiosity and interest and kind of wonder at the world, that kind of aligns nicely with what I was thinking about in terms of your approach to farming earlier.
Hmm.
The second question is, how do you think about failure and how do you respond when it happens?
Oh, I think what's coming to mind is when I started getting involved in doing like community garden type things and any kind of social change. I actually, to be quite honest, had very low expectations that anything would change. Just based on the news and looking at the world as it is, and myself being like one of 8 billion people or something, trying my best, and just seeing how fast and how fragile life is. I set very low expectations, almost no expectations. So if something happens, then I'm not let down. And if something does happen, then I'm super excited that something has happened. So I try to have low expectations. Um, I'm not sure if that's good advice, but
Nihilism.
Well, I mean, again, back to like
so when
that.
it comes to failure, I don't necessarily see it as failure
Yeah.
because I didn't really expect it to work in the first place. So um,
Or
yeah.
yeah. Or
Also,
for some.
failure is, I mean, just to say that failure requires like a judgment. Like you gotta, you know, failure in life, it can be very, very hard to say when something has failed or hasn't failed because things play out over very long periods of time. So just because I tried to do something like today and it didn't work, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen long term. And maybe it required that moment of, failure in this moment to get to the next stage.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a very linear way of thinking, I think. Whereas life is like complex and dynamic, and you don't know when that moment of change will come.
Mm-hmm.
And it could look like failure to me, but to another person, it could look like success.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find like that failure success thing often also is us imbuing our personal interest into sort of the world around us and if it doesn't work the way that we want it to, then we frame that as failure. But that's not necessarily what's going on with that other thing.
I
That's
deal
doing.
with this a lot actually in my work with like the municipalities, parks staff, and others around community gardens and things. They'll look at like a community garden that has so-called weeds in it, and they'll say, "Oh, that's a failure. It failed." And then they won't look at all the relationships and that formed through that space.
Mm-hmm.
That's not part of their their judgment. They're not measuring those things as
Mm-hmm.
part of their
Yeah.
what works and what didn't work.
I would say even like on the success side here, because Adam's right, like they kind of play off each other, right? And Jeff Menig, who I know both of you know, uh, who's a mutual friend, former chief of Beausoleil First Nation, said to me at one point, if you asked the rain, even it would tell you it's responsible for the spring. Um, and just that idea of we well, that was a success, therefore we were all, it was just what we did, and not seeing the unseen things. And failure, similarly to your point, Jacob, is we're looking for one particular outcome, it doesn't happen, therefore everything is unsuccessful, and we personalize that just as much. So maybe your approach of low expectations is much more rooted in the idea of the complexity of how change happens, and it's not easily pinpointed to one event or one person. It's a whole ecosystem of things that you may not even know were around that allowed that thing to happen in a certain way or not allowed to happen a certain way, right? Anyways, so I thought I'd share that.
Hmm.
I think I might on the fly be changing our third question here. So typically our third question is, what's your greatest fear for Ontario and your greatest hope? But I think I'd like to actually like get this more kind of resource oriented in terms of like what someone listening to this could walk away with. And so it doesn't have to be directly tied to what we've been talking about, but just something that you have found enlightening recently. A book, a podcast, whatever. A poem, or an activity of some sort.
Well, one thing I did want to get across in terms of just going back to that local example of alternatives happening is I've been thinking a lot about our Simcoe County forests. And if you go to the Simcoe County for the local, I think we're going to have maybe local listeners, but if you go to the Simcoe County Museum and on the archives and the website, you'll actually see pictures of like sand dunes of like when they deforested over a century ago, when they deforested Simcoe County, and it's very sandy and the sand was blowing, and you get these sand dunes that were forming across the landscape and blocking roads. And I'm envisioning like sand plows, like we have snow plows, but they had sand plows to clear the roads of all these blowing sand. And then as a response to that ecological crisis, they started planting trees. And in particular, they created public forests, so publicly owned and managed forests. And there's lots to say about how well they're managed or not managed, and the kinds of things that are planted and who's in charge of that. But I think the idea of planting a forest 100 years ago that people 100 years from then are still benefiting from and enjoying and accessing can be an inspiration for us, especially in this conversation around food and farming. And I'm envisioning this kind of, Simcoe County farms, a similar kind of response from the community where we can, as a wide community, through our municipal governments and maybe, or even our provincial, federal governments, create spaces in our communities that are publicly protected, that are preserved, that we can invest in together to create collective assets, farms that people can participate in, that our schools could visit and engage with and learn from and access the food from to feed our children. And that in 100 years from now, we'll look back and we'll have a network of beautiful, productive, sustainable farms that will be, just as that will be a legacy that people can enjoy 7-10 generations from now. But we don't really have, nobody's really talking about in that way at all. They're not thinking long term, like what it's going to be like. Everyone's very short term, just trying to think about themselves for the now. And so I see that Simcoe County Forest is kind of that inspirational thing that exists all around us, but very few people are aware of that history and what led to that. And I don't know anyone who's really proposing anything similar to create now. It's almost like we don't have an imagination anymore.
Mm.
Yeah.
I was just going to add on to that for the benefit of the listeners was that not only did it start Simcoe County Forest, but E.C. Drury, who was the premier at the time, and I believe his name was Zavitz, was a local forester. And not only did they start the Simcoe County Forest, but a lot of that came from starting up reforestation across Ontario because the Oak Ridge Moraine was similarly deforested. Lots of Ontario was pretty deforested, fires, the whole bit. And so if you ever in the Midhurst area and you're on Nursery Road, that's where the tree nurseries began, where we would grow trees to replant across the province. Now, the nurseries in Simcoe County are now closed, and that whole program, unfortunately, went the way of the dodo bird. In the last decade, was the final nail on that coffin. However, to Jacob's point, that started off a whole revolution of reforestation across Ontario, and it began in Simcoe County. So that's a pretty cool little thing. Anyways, that's all.
Yeah, I mean, and for this to happen, I think that we would have to finally start learning before we reach an acute crisis point. Where, like you mentioned, where there are parts like around Edenvale where there was basically desert conditions in Simcoe County for a while before they started up these programs. So hopefully we can do that before we reach that point with food. But Jacob, thank you so much for joining us. We need to do this again and sort of get into the meat of some of these issues because they're fascinating and super important, and there's so much more to talk about. And next time, yeah, maybe it'll be a smoother start. But yeah, if not, it doesn't matter.
My apologies.
No, no worries, no worries. It was fine.
It's how we roll. Everybody knows we're pretty unprofessional by now.
Yeah, that's the way it goes. So,
There you
folks,
go.
thanks for joining us. We typically are here on Tuesdays, but it is the summer, so some Tuesdays we're not. We'll see you next time.